we're thinking about Daniel in a way that will be interesting and all-encompassing. And several people have said, I'm really interested. What made you think of doing Daniel? And I was like, I don't know if it came to me in a dream or, I'm trying to not just lock in on New Testament texts, or Old Testament texts. And I've not really spent any time studying Daniel. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to pick one of these apocalyptic books and see where we end up. And so Daniel just bubbled to the top. Yes, Glenn. It could have been the writing on the wall. You're right. So I promise I wasn't locked in a den with tigers or lions, though. That did not convince me. But all along the way, I've been having conversations with people who are interested and excited about it. But Sally Angevine on Monday gave me a text. I don't know who Pat Terry is, or the Pat Terry group. And several people looked at me and said, I can't believe you don't know who Pat Terry is. But I've never heard of Pat Terry. But evidently Pat Terry wrote kind of a satirical song about Daniel. And I thought, what better place to share that audio file than with this group. So that's where we're going to start. It's about 3 minutes. I don't know if you'll be able to hear it well. If you can't, I can provide the text later. But this is not Spotify, so you can't just put up, the lyrics won't just auto-load. Ron, will you play it? Uh-oh. Oh, there you go.
He got too much attention. They had a little meeting and proceeded to fix his wagon. Well, their feet were dragging with a doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Well, they were thinking of ways that they could drag old Daniel down. The Dan was so good, not one fault could be found. Quick as a flash, a conspirator spoke. He said, Dan's a real fanatic, so we'll get him with religion. They closed a little meeting and proceeded to rule out praying with the king's okay and a do-do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do-do. Well, the news spread fast in the first big press release. He said, no more praying, but Dan stayed on his knees. Took him off to jail in a kneeling position. Said, we hope you stay for dinner. Then I threw him to the lion. But Daniel didn't worry. Said, I'll see you once again in the morning. He just stood there yawning with a do-do-do-do-do. Do-do-do-do-do. Early in the morning when the sun came up, the king was feeling down. He went to the lions and he looked in the window, and what do you think he found? Oh, Daniel was leading those lions in a hymn. They were clapping their big brown paws. He said, an angel of the Lord done arrived last night, and he clasped them lions' jaws. They really did now. The king is so excited that he wrote a new decree. Listen, all the people, won't you lend your ear to me? He said, Daniel, really show me that it's God for living, because we threw him to the lions and the lions would need him. So won't you all to listen to what Dan's Lord is saying?
All right. I imagine you probably couldn't hear one word the man said. I'm sorry. You heard Daniel a lot, and you heard do. It really is a cute song, and so I'm sure if you put in Pat Terry Daniel on YouTube, it's safe, and you might be able to actually hear what it says. I'm sorry. He does. He sings in English. He sings in English. So this is where we're headed this month. So tonight, I'm going to just give an overview of the structure of the book. And then because of the way the book is structured, we're going to look specifically next week at mirroring chapters, chapter 2 and 7. And then the following week, we're going to look at 3 and 6, and then 4 and 5. And then we're going to look at what I think might be the most difficult portion of the book, at the last 4 or 5 chapters. So that's where we're headed in the weeks to come. But first, I want to know what you already know about Daniel. What is it that you already know about Daniel? Don't be afraid. We're all friends. He was good, obedient. He interpreted dreams. He was taken to Babylon. One of Lot's who are. Yeah. He was. Yeah. That's right. That's right. He survived the lions. That's right. Yep. Interpreted lots of different dreams, writings on the wall. What else? Anything else? There you go. What else? Y'all wouldn't eat the king's food.
There's a diet named after him.
Is that right?
There's a very popular Daniel diet.
The Daniel diet. I'm going to have to look that up. All right. Probably vegetarian, yeah. So a lot of good stuff about this book. It's one of those that, I've often wondered why we tell children stories about floods that wipe out the earth, and lion's den. There's a lot of treachery in the fact that you might go into a lion's den and not come out. But we tell grade school children about it all the time. Anyway, we know a lot about Daniel. So this is the picture. Again, I love the Bible Project. If you don't know the Bible Project, it is a great resource on just about every book of the Bible, okay? And this is kind of their idea map of the book of Daniel, okay? It is. If you just Google the Bible Project Daniel, then it'll take you to about an 8-minute video that will describe the overview, and that's really the source material for my first night, is that background information. As we think about Daniel, there have been 2 very different features that have attracted readers to the book. It opens with dramatic stories that kind of relate the adventures of Daniel and 3 other men at the Babylonian and Persian court. Of course, the 4 distinguished themselves by their skills as counselors to a series of kings, and their skill is interpretive, isn't it? It's not interpretive dance, but it is interpreting dreams, right? And some other omens that the kings have been shown or come to the kings. And they serve at court without compromising their commitment to the God of Israel. Part of the food thing is we're not eating that food, right? Which gets them in trouble. But they all along do not compromise. They stand up under the pressure, and God delivers. Indeed, they show themselves willing to accept martyrdom rather than go back on their commitment to God, and God honors their faithfulness by seeing that they escape at every turn. The other feature of the book is a series of extraordinary dreams and other revelations given to only Daniel himself, right? And they dominate kind of the second part of the book that we're going to look at. And to a large extent, the visions are couched in code and symbols that, beasts coming out of the sea, a ram and a goat doing battle, unnamed northern and southern kings seeking to conquer one another. And lots of those have gotten theologians and folks who write apocalyptic literature today. They've got a lot of folks projecting end times, right? So that's where a lot of that work comes from. But we're going to start kind of at the beginning. And we're starting kind of at Babylonians' first attack on Jerusalem. And the story is set right after this. And the Babylonians had plundered the city and had taken the temple down, and they had put waves of Israelites in exile. And Daniel and his 3 friends are among them. Okay? Not only that, they are part of the royal family of David. Daniel, who's later named Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends, we've already heard those Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are named. And this book tells about their struggles to maintain hope living in a land as captives. Okay, so that is the book that we're looking at. Now the way the book is designed is it's broken up into 2. You see this button over on the left. The first 6 chapters are stories about Daniel and his friends. And basically, in Babylon, in chapters 7 through 12, are kind of these visions that Daniel is having and helping also interpret. Okay? And so that's kind of the 2-part, that's the way you can divide the book up. So what's also interesting, I think, and what I learned studying this, as that the 2-part shape is made even more interesting by something else, and that is the book's language. If you'll see at the very bottom, the original manuscript, chapter 1, was written in Hebrew. The middle 6 chapters were written in Aramaic, a totally different language, and then the final in Hebrew again. And so these cousin languages that are helping the reader understand what goes on, Aramaic would have been spoken widely among ancient empires, but Aramaic is a cousin language, right? And Hebrew kind of winds it up. The design, I think, intentionally pulls out these middle chapters, these chapters 2 through 7, and that's one of the reasons we're going to look at them like we are over the next couple weeks. They are a coherent section, and they highlight the importance of chapters 2 through 7 as kind of a standalone portion of the book. So, chapter 1 tells the story, right? This pressure to give up who they are, their identity. It is basically the story of, middle school politics, right? It is who you're going to be, right? And these Israelites are stuck in another culture And they're trying to live like they've been called. They're trying to live like the covenant. And all along, they're being tripped up, right? It introduces the basic attention of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're wise and capable. They're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon, but they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity. And they're asked to both live and eat like Babylonians. And we know from Torah and from all those laws, that is not a good thing, right? Food laws are everywhere in Torah, and they are trying to hold tightly to it. So they refuse and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and it puts them in danger at every turn. And so you've got this idea that being put in danger is a choice that they've made, but at every turn God delivers, right? They end up being elevated by the king of Babylon in a crazy turn of events. You would think somebody who might be in charge, seeing people stand out of another culture might knock them down, but the opposite ends up happening, right? And so Daniel 1 seems to clearly be an introduction and tells the story of the wisdom that is gained and the prestige that they kind of rise to without losing their integrity. Now, have you ever experienced something like that? We throw around the word persecution in 2023 as Americans like it's a real thing. But we're, in a lot of ways, especially as American Christian, we won the birth lottery because there are a lot more dangerous places to live in the world if you love Jesus, right? But what kinds of persecution might you have experienced or remember growing up? Anybody have a story? I promise I'm not going to judge you and say, that's not real persecution. I mean, and I don't necessarily, when I use the word persecution, I'm not necessarily talking only about spiritual or religious persecution. You can be persecuted for being a dork and wanting better friends in middle school, right? Anybody have a story of believing something and wanting to stand up for it? If not, I'll tell one, but I'm trying to offer a chance for you. I don't know if I've ever told you about my first semester of writing at Clemson and being in a writing class with a professor from the Northeast. I think he was from Maine, maybe Massachusetts, but he was agnostic and said at the beginning of the course, he said, I know I'm in a southern state college, and I know there's probably Christians in this room, but if you use the word Jesus in any of my papers, you will fail that paper. And I was like, I've never heard anyone talk like that ever in my life. Who is this man? And is he the devil? Right? I never experienced anything like that. And looking back on that, I never put Jesus in the paper. And looking back on that, I'm like, maybe I should have had the gumption to stand up. I would have been eating the pigs here if I was with these four guys, right? It takes a lot of character and fortitude to stand up and be faithful to God from the very beginning. And that's what these gentlemen are doing. It also sets the book as a whole in the context of this exile. It was about 70 years of exile and covers both by stories and visions, and Daniel is telling these stories along the way, okay? And so it lays a foundation to consider the question, when Jeremiah's promise of Jerusalem's restoration will last be fulfilled. Okay? So that's the question of the day and the question of the book. Now, after this begins, after chapter 1, we look at the Aramaic section. Okay? And it's got really cool design. And there are lots of scholars that talk about the way 2 and 7 mirror one another, the stories that are told, the way 3 and 6 do, and 4 and 5. And so this first king of Babylon has a dream that it turns out only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is, of course, Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. And this dream is the first of lots of symbols and symbolic visions in the book, and this one kind of outweighs or underlays and introduces a basic storyline of all of the rest of them, okay? Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they'll all fall or fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come, right? And will confront all of these kingdoms and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule, okay? And then, after this, after 2 and 3, it tells the story, the famous story of these 3 friends. What do they refuse to do? Bow before the statue. They were asked to worship an idol, right? To bow before and worship the statue. They refuse, and this statue, kind of like in chapter 2, represents the king in his imperial power. So the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into the furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king, who acknowledges that their God is the true God, right? And after that story come a pair of stories about 2 Babylonian kings. The father, Nebuchadnezzar, and his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power. And so, like in chapter 2, God warns both of them in dreams, right? Then visions. And also, like in chapter 2, who's the only person who can interpret them? Daniel. He's like a walking thesaurus, right? Walking dictionary. A good looking glass. He helps them see. And he says that both kings are to humble themselves before God. And do they do it? No. They arrogantly resist. It's absolutely not happening. And so you can see we've dealt with 2. We're talking about 3, and then you've got the two prideful kings in 4 and 5. And so Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field, but then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns. He's restored as king, and this is the contrast, in contrast with the son who does not humble himself before God. And then he does not live very much longer. He's assassinated later in the book. So these 2 stories draw this imagery from Genesis 1 and 2 and Psalm 8. This idea that humans are depicted in the royal image of God. Okay? Humanity and humans depicted as the royal image of God. And God has given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field, the birds of the air. And they're doing this kind of as stewards of the true king of God, right? And They end up human kingdoms looking at themselves in the mirror and seeing themselves puffed up forget, right? Don't we? And then when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a god, they become less than human and turn into beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6 and the famous story of the lion's den. And this pairs with chapter 3. Probably the two most famous stories from Daniel, fiery furnace and the lion's den. They are pairs, and we'll talk about that in a couple weeks in more in depth. But basically, Daniel being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god, and also is sentenced to death. But this time, what is it? Not a fiery furnace. He gets to lay down with lions, right? And so, but God delivers him from the beasts, and like his friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair to two, and is the center of the book, where all the themes of the book kind of come together. But this time, it's a dream about Daniel. Ironically, you can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger helps translate it for him. Sees a series of beasts, the one like a lion, then one like a bear, a winged leopard. And each of these are symbolizing arrogant kingdoms. And at last, all of this super beast is identified as a huge... Think of, I guess, is it Star Wars? It's not Star Wars. It's, what's Darth Vader's empire called? I don't even know. Maybe I shouldn't have taken this tangent with you. The Empire, right? So, sorry. Sorry. I thought it was a different, I'm not a big fan. But you've got this evil kingdom, full of horns. The evil empire is what's being described here. And that's a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament, right? There's one specific horn who's the image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecute God's people. And they're symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their kingdom in the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and sets up his throne. God destroys the super beast and exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. So God can look back over all of this and see how all the stories fit together to this climax in 7. And they're meant to offer hope to people who are suffering, people who are persecuted, people who are destitute, right? And these stories are meant to offer hope to these folks in this nation. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and become beasts. And so these visions encourage them to have patience, right? That God's people are to wait for him and to bring his kingdom to rule over our world and vindicate the suffering of his people. All right? So we're the lion's share, for lack of a better phrase, the lion's share of our time is going to be spent in the middle of the book, right? Because that's where a lot of the good work is. And then the last week we're going to look at this final vision, right? And this rule over our world and vindicating suffering people that God is going to be about when God announces it, what's our first question? God says, I'm going to vindicate things. What's our first question? When? All right. What time are you going to be here? Right? I mean, it's the same thing the disciples were dealing with after Jesus. Several of them start dying in the early church, and they're like, wait a minute. We didn't have this problem. We didn't think this problem was going to come. What are we going to do? We thought Jesus would have already come back, but we got apostles and disciples dying here. It caused strife in the church. So that's the question that's raised. When is God going to do that? And that's what the final three visions of the book are set out to kind of tell us about. So in chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about those beasts from chapter 7. But this time, they're a ram and then a goat. Okay? And the images of kind of the Persians, but then also kind of ancient Greece. And out of the goat comes a whole bunch of horns of, again, evil kings. Anytime you see horns, evil kings. And we're told more about this evil king, that he'll attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people in his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel's puzzled, okay? Especially to when Daniel starts asking the question, when's this going to happen, right? So he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God talks about the exile and the fact that the exile would only last how long? 70 years, right? And so for Daniel, he's been keeping track, much like George is, about what time it is, right? He's been keeping track. He's like, 70 years is almost up. What is going on here? So he asked God, hey, could you get busy? Could we fulfill this promise soon? But an angel comes and informs Daniel that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued, and so there's been extra time added, right? And so their time of exile is going to continue 7 times longer than Jeremiah even envisioned. Daniel's disturbed by it and has one final vision. And we're shown the same sequence of kingdoms: Persia, then Greece, and then Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, ruin, right? It all ends. There's been endless debate about what all these visions refer to. And many see a clear connection with a Syrian king called Antiochus in the late 160s. He killed faithful Jews left and right, all over the place. Set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to Rome and the Roman Empire, right? And their role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of the temple in 70. And still others think that we've yet to reach that day, right? That we are still waiting on the day when all of this will be fulfilled. And now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers don't match any of these views perfectly, but it opens up the possibility and the sense that maybe there's truth in all of it, right? That the symbols stand for all of it. So what we're going to think about is the fact that the book of Daniel has, no matter how we parse it, Daniel is a book about hope, right? I love the way they use a pattern and a promise for all generations, right? every one of these stories is about someone feeling big in their britches, whether it's a king or whether it's someone else thinking they're bigger than God, and then there's a leveling, right? God steps in and levels things out. And it's always the promise of gracious giving, right? And so it's a hope for all generations of God's people, including us. It was helpful in the days of Antiochus's empire, and it's been helpful ever since, right? That kind of hope is helpful for us today when we are at our wits' end, is it not? It is the hope that we show up for, and it's the thing that binds us together as a community of faith. It's why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront oppressive leaders from Jerusalem. He used a lot of that same imagery. And so this is why John, the visionary who wrote Revelation, could adapt these visions of Daniel and apply them to Rome in his day, and also project toward future empires. And so the point of Daniel is that even today, all generations of readers can find this pattern and promise. We will devolve into violent beasts. That's just the way we are, right? But there is hope. And it is the hope of God and the transcendence of God and the power that God is the true king. And God will confront the beast, that God will confront all evil, and that we will have a final deliverance, right? God will rescue this world and God's people by bringing the kingdom of God to bear over every nation. And so this is a message in a book of hope, and it's where we're headed over the next 4 weeks. So, what questions do you have for me as we prepare? So, much like, I forget the last thing, James, sorry. I'm going to encourage you to read all of Daniel. It's not a long book. I'm going to encourage you to read all of Daniel, but especially next week, review chapters 2 and 7. Because we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive, and there might be some conversation around the table, and so you're going to want to know what's happening and do your homework a little. And so your only homework is to at least read chapter 2 and chapter 7. It would be best if you read 1 through 7 at least, right? But if you can read 2 and 7, that would be great, and we'll study them together next week.